Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner and research director over here at California YIMBY, where we're hard at work making California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Welcome back to Abundance. Can you believe it's already our 10th episode? And we have a really special episode in store for you today. We're chatting with Emily Jacobson, a recent graduate of the Goldman School Master of Public Policy program at UC Berkeley and the inaugural California YIMBY Research Fellow. I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Emily has just published an amazing report published by California YIMBY titled The Dysfunctional Metropolis, Reforming Los Angeles's Land Use Planning and Entitlement. In the first half of the episode, we spent a lot of time talking about what she found about what has gone wrong with land use entitlement in Los Angeles. And then we pull it out and talk about the broader implications for cities all across the country. We're joined in this episode by a very special co-host, Sarah Karlinsky, a senior advisor at SPUR, a public policy organization that works to create an equitable, sustainable, and prosperous Bay Area, a really fantastic organization. A little bit more on two things here. First, the California YIMBY Research Fellow Program. This is essentially a program we created to support graduate and professional students to do work that advances our mission of building a more affordable, equitable, sustainable California. We have just had our first inaugural fellow, Emily Jacobson, who produced this report as part of her master's studies. If you're interested in this, do head over to the website. We will soon be taking applications for fall research fellows. And if, like I say, if you're in a graduate program or a professional program, we would love to hear from you. In the meantime, do feel free to send me an email. I'm at Nolan, Nolan, @cayimby.org, and we can chat more about it. It's our 10th episode. Wow, can you believe it? We made it. We have a lot more exciting episodes in store for you. There are already 2 or 3 already in the hopper, recorded, ready to go, and we have so many more coming. Please take a moment, hit subscribe, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on Spotify or iTunes. Hit that subscribe button, leave a review, help more people find what we're doing here. And of course, leave a review. Let us know who you want us to talk to. Anybody that you think actually could be a great guest to sit down and have a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long conversation about the ideas that are going to build a more affordable California. We want to know who you want to hear from. With that, we have a lot to talk about. On to the show. This is somewhat of a special episode. Very excited. Our inaugural research fellow at California YIMBY, Emily Jacobson, joins us to discuss her new report on the dysfunctional city and what's gone wrong with Los Angeles City Council. And we're joined by Sarah Karlinsky, of course, of SPUR. We have our organizational backgrounds that we're repping, right? Emily's got the plants. So, like, I guess
Emily's the urban growth boundary. We're the it film.
Perfect. It's because I couldn't choose between my California YIMBY and SPUR loyalties.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, so yeah, I mean, 1,000 feet. Most people, I think, in California kind of know the situation with LA, but I don't know if you want to sort of top line, Emily. Sort of, there's been a lot of controversies recently of like every possible variety with LA, and a lot of them touch on entitlement. I don't know if there's like any particular that stick in your mind that like are important to like understand like why we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, so you're right that there has been a lot of controversy. I think in the past 5 or so years, there's been 4 council members charged with charges related to corruption. The one that stands out the most is Jose Huizar, who was a council member for, I think, the full 12-year term he could have. And he was the chair of the Planning and Land Use Management Committee. And he was able to, through that power that he held as the chairman, extort, and this is, I believe he's admitted to that and pled guilty, up to $1.5 million from developers by saying, in a pay-to-play scheme, if you don't pay me X amount, either through cash or a gift or a political campaign donation, or a donation to a local nonprofit, like a private school, that he wouldn't allow the project to go forward. And he did that successfully for several years, I think 2013 to 2018. And when that broke and it came out that the FBI was investigating him, I think it it really just disrupted a lot of people's, trust in government, in the city government, and that has only continued. Most recently in October 2022, there was the leak of the recording in which 3 council members used a lot of pretty important language, but talking more about the redistricting process rather than entitlement.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, if they know about zoning at all, most people, right, of course, live happy, normal lives where they don't think about this stuff. But if they are aware of zoning, I think the idea is, okay, you follow the rules on the books, you crack open the zoning ordinance, you figure out what you can and can't do with your lot, and then you go get your permit, right? And I mean, I think that's what an average person is wondering, why would somebody like Quasar have how could they be in a position where they could actually extort or enter some, maybe extort is a strong word, mutually agreeable but highly illegal arrangement, right, to get these permits? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's good to not say extort, but I mean, I think that's the legal language, so I feel comfortable using it. For racketeering. In Los Angeles, about 75% of projects go through a discretionary entitlement process. And that means that to be approved, the project isn't just being checked for, does this fit zoning, does this meet code? It has to be decided on an individual basis by some city decision makers, usually appointed or elected. And so when we talk about entitlement, we just mean the approval process by which the city says, okay, sure, you can use this land for the proposed purpose. And in Los Angeles, there are so many different types of entitlement applications, which is kind of crazy, but just taking a large scale residential project that might have to get a rezoning, that might have to get a change in the height district. And at the very least, it'll have to go through this thing called site plan review, because it has 50 or more units. But if any of those things are true, the project has to go through this discretionary process, where it goes to, after it, of course, initially goes to the planning department, and then after that to the city planning commission, who are appointed. And then in Los Angeles, it goes also to the city council. And the city council ends up becoming the ultimate arbiter on a lot of decisions related to projects, both residential and not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple interesting things in there that are important to pull out. Is the original idea of discretionary entitlement would be in rare or exceptional cases, right, where something just, certainly in the cases of variances where it's there's some unusual condition with the lot, or there's just been a mapping error, we put your lot in the wrong zoning district, right? I mean, my understanding of the original idea of these pathways was that these were for exceptional cases or weird cases, or when conditions have changed rapidly. But I mean, it's as you sort of point out in your report, this has just become almost the normal way that LA entitles anything and everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are, of course, a lot of projects that should go through discretionary review. Maybe a massive a mall or a stadium, or there are things that do have significant impacts on the land and the people who live in that area. Things related to the airport, maybe. So there's definitely room and for discretionary approval, and it's important that it exists. But what happens in LA is that the rules are so strict that so many things end up going through discretionary, in a way that's kind of arbitrary, or is kind of nonsensical. So like I mentioned site plan review earlier, any residential property with more than 50 units has to go through discretionary review. And that threshold is, and granted, there is a little bit of wiggle room, but they've carved out some exceptions in recent years. But it doesn't make any sense that a project with 55 units would be more harmful to the environment or to the community than the project with 49. And the other reason that a lot of projects have to go through discretionary review is just that the zoning and the plans in LA are pretty outdated. And the zoning itself is restrictive. And as LA and all of California faces this housing crisis and really needs to build a lot more multifamily housing, they're coming up against zoning rules that you have to get exceptions to be able to build the things that are kind of necessary.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two. Moving into like the recommendations here, right? Like, I think you point out really rightly. So there's two issues here. One is a bunch of projects just get forced to go through discretionary permitting, and yeah, this was something that shocked me when I came to California. Like the idea of a discretionary process for otherwise completely compliant projects just because they cross some unit threshold. That like is not how a lot of other jurisdictions do it. That's really weird, and especially impactful in the California context, because when you have to do discretionary permitting, you have to do CEQA, which, I don't want this to be like everybody beating up on CEQA as usual, but like that's a problem, right? Because then that opens you up to litigation, and at best you have to do this big giant study, and it just makes it really, really hard for small developers to do these types of projects. But you point out too many projects get thrown into this universe, and then when projects are thrown into this universe, like the process is just kind of messy and chaotic. Like there's a lot of appeals processes. There's many applications that end up in the council are going to get politicized. I think another thing that most listeners probably are aware of is goes by different names in different cities. Councilmanic privilege, isn't that what it's called in LA? Yeah.
That it is. Yeah. So councilmanic privilege or prerogative, you hear about a lot in the LA context and also in Philadelphia and Chicago, where it's, I guess, aldermanic privilege. And the idea is that the council member who represents that district has almost full say in what gets built in their district. And all the other council members defer to the local council member. So for example, in LA, a developer who wants to build a project will go to the council member's office before they even submit an application to the planning department, because they need to find out if the local council member will support that project. And if they don't, then it's almost kind of dead in the water, and they don't move forward with the application, or they make some kinds of alterations to make it minimal to the local council member. But just the fact that the local council member has so much say in what gets built is, I think, pretty extraordinary. And that's especially true because LA is a city of 4 million people and there's only 15 council members. So each person represents over 260,000 people, which is bigger than a lot of towns and counties and across the country. And so you hear a lot about LA that it's like 15 fiefdoms or 15 mini mayors. And I think a lot of people do view the council that way, and how they're able to have this high level of discretion over everything that happens in their district, and especially with development.
Yeah, so on the 15 fiefdoms piece, right? There is a lot of reform discussion right now. One that seems to always get a lot of attention is expanding the council. How do you feel about that? Like, what?
Yeah, I think in general, I sort of apart from development, it could be a good idea. It is kind of crazy how big the council districts are in LA. It's bigger than any other city in the country. So I understand why people are talking about that and considering it as a potential reform. But in terms of development, if you don't change the culture of councilmanic privilege. I don't think expanding the council would have an impact. It remains to be seen, but I would expect that, if it continues to be districts and solely districts, maybe no at-large council members or multi-member districts or anything like that, the local council member might continue to still have a lot of say over what happens in their district, and still be the ultimate decision maker. And with smaller districts, you might expect them to be more homogenous, for there to be a stronger link between constituents and their council member, that second point especially is good, but it allows for more NIMBYism. If people in that district don't want a project, it's even more likely that the council member would say no to that project, and it would ultimately not go anywhere, even if it was, would have citywide impacts or have benefits for people across the city.
I actually had a question about that. First of all, I just want to compliment you on your excellent report, and everybody should read it, and it's really terrific. And I had a lot of thoughts. While I was reading it about sort of the San Francisco context and kind of comparing that to the Los Angeles context and some other places too that maybe we can get into later. But just on the topic of kind of the structure of governance in Los Angeles, and kind of the relationship of, I had a number of questions about the relationship of council authority vis-a-vis mayoral authority. So maybe my first question is sort of about whether Los Angeles, is it a strong mayor system? I mean, you talked a little bit about when council can override, the mayoral veto, or when mayor can override council. But I just was wondering if you could get into that a little bit more. Is sort of one set of questions that I had. And then the other, I just was totally fascinated when you said that so many of the council decisions are unanimous, because in San Francisco, the political dynamic is totally different, where you have, well, we're both a city and a county, so we don't have a city council, we have a board of supervisors, but there's just like a lot of politicking between different supervisors who sort of fall into different political camps, and then various fights between them and the mayor. We have a very strong mayor system in San Francisco, but it just seems like there are multiple different kind of power bases, so you don't get that unanimity that you describe in Los Angeles, which maybe is in the LA context is much more because of the councilmanic privilege that you describe. And sort of, it's like, I was like, oh, it's almost like, it's like an orderly system. It's just like a corrupt system. So yeah, I was wondering if you talk a little bit about that. And then my second question is just, I was very curious about who appoints the planning commissioners. That was one question that I had while I was reading. So those, maybe just, we could start there.
Yeah, those are all great questions, and I'm glad you asked them. Los Angeles has a weak mayor system historically. The council has been the main policymaker, or it's the legislative body, but it has been most influential in setting policy for the city since its founding. And it's fair to say that there have been some reforms to make the mayor of Los Angeles stronger and have more authority in recent years, but I think the council continues to be very strong, and especially with land use development and entitlement. I think I forgot the second question. Was it about? Well,
it was about who appoints the planning commissioners.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, the question I forgot is about the unanimity of council decisions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So this was also really shocking to me. There's a paper that came out that showed that 97% of votes by the Los Angeles City Council are unanimous. And that's because basically everything is decided in committee. So once it reaches the full council, they will just vote yes to approve the recommendation issued by the committee. So I think this is probably something that's pretty unique about Los Angeles. I can't speak to other cities, but each committee, most of them have 5 members, are really powerful. And so when we're talking about land use, that means that the people on the Plum Committee, which is planning and land use management. So
which, by the way, is the most amazing name for a committee that has a lot of power like this to like dole out discretionary approvals. You're literally sitting on the Plum Committee. It's kind of, it's a little much. It's a little on the nose.
Yeah. It's also just like a cute name. Sounds a lot better than Planning and Land Use Management Committee. But that's all to say that the council members who are on that committee almost, I don't want to say single-handedly, but as a collective, set the direction for land use across the city, and rarely is there any kind of disagreement on the council floor. At least maybe it happens behind doors, but it's a lot of unanimity.
So interesting. And then, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say to the last point about who appoints the commissioners, they're all appointed by the mayor. And so this is where the mayor exerts control, is through their appointment process. And just to say this up front, Los Angeles has a city planning commission that oversees the whole city. So that's pretty standard. But it also has 7 area planning commissions, and those commissioners are also appointed by the mayor. But those area planning commissions oversee a smaller geographic area. And of course, there are 7 of those.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry to interrupt.
No, that was fine. I mean, it is very interesting when I think about, again, the San Francisco context. There is a land use committee, but what the land use committee does is reviews it, usually legislation related to land use, including zoning legislation. So it's like sort of plan scale development that they're looking at. And yeah, so it's just kind of a different system. I mean, San Francisco is also very different from LA because it's roughly 800,000 people, and LA is what, 4.3 million, and just the square footage is just, the scale of Los Angeles is just totally different. And then thirdly, San Francisco is a strong mayor system, so like there's a lot of authority consolidated within the mayor, but the Board of Supervisors does exercise significant control vis-a-vis these discretionary entitlements because of their capacity to hear CEQA appeals and their ability to, they're the legislative body that votes on, zoning changes. So back when we were doing more area plans, they played a very significant role in, approving or disproving those. And now there's more citywide planning that happens. It's less sort of area by area, at least in the San Francisco context.
Well, and I think you get at this in your report. Another challenge that LA, not to riff on the obvious fact, but LA is just really big, right? And there's a lot of different contexts. And to my mind, a really, really important thing to understand about why we ended up with the institutions we have is that, like, people have been trying to leave LA, right? Like, a lot of the current framework emerges in the aftermath of the San Fernando Valley trying to, secede from LA. So we get things like neighborhood councils and area planning commissions, right? That comes in that wave, right?
Yeah, it did. And I think there's been 2 major waves of reform that have gotten us to this place. And one is from roughly like the late 1960s through the 80s, which was a period where members of the community wanted a lot more control over what was happening in their neighborhoods and across the city. And so there became a lot more opportunities for public participation, which is good. But it also made it resulted in a system where council members and commissioners in the planning department were really responsive to what people who were already in that neighborhood wanted to see, which is sort of the root of NIMBYism, is people who already live there saying, I don't want my neighborhood to change. I don't want, you know, you people or something to move in here or disrupt how things are. And that went through, so this period of increased local control, and I would say peaked kind of in 1987, I think, which was when Proposition U was passed, which significantly downzoned a lot of Los Angeles, basically most of the commercial corridors by half. And it just made it so much harder to build anything in those areas or change them from what form they were in the 1980s. And also I'll add that I think in around 1970, the city changed to having community plans. So this is sort of like the area plans you were talking about in San Francisco, Sarah. There are 35 community plan areas in Los Angeles, and those areas geographically haven't changed since they were first established. But planning is done on a neighborhood basis, and these plans are not updated as nearly as often as they should be. The council just passed the new Hollywood community plan, I think last month. But if I remember correctly, that plan hadn't been updated since the 1980s or 1990s. So a lot has changed in Hollywood in 30 years. But those are a couple of things. And then lastly, about the San Fernando Valley wanting to secede, that threat happened in the late 90s. And in response, the city developed and passed the new city charter. So for a few years, there was a lot of effort and a lot of community members who were involved in and setting the direction for the new city charter. And they did talk about things like expanding the council, which of course didn't happen then. And then the voters approved it in 1999. And so most of the structure of land use planning in LA is set in that 1999 city charter. And it is what established the neighborhood councils, which are a quasi-judicial, I don't know what to say, quasi-administrative, quasi-political body. There are 99 of them in Los Angeles, and any person can say, we're going to develop a neighborhood council as long as it doesn't geographically overlap with another one. And these groups get to issue statements to the council, basically offering recommendations or stating their position on certain things. And today it is a major way that members of the public are able to get involved and express their preferences to the council. And Nolan, famously a board member of the North Westwood Neighborhood Council. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for reminding everyone of my credentials here. Yeah, no, I mean, there's such weird entities. We had something like this in New York. They're called community boards. And in New York, there are 59 of them, and they have 50 members. So it's a little bit of a circus. And they're all like appointed by the BP, the borough president, and the council member. Yeah, in LA, yeah, you mentioned they can form kind of out of any existing area. The North Westwood Neighborhood Council actually was formed because a coalition of students and Westwood business owners broke off from the Westwood Neighborhood Council to form an entity that was a little bit more favorable to, small business permitting and student housing construction. Yeah, I mean, they're weird entities, right? Because they don't have any formal like power on land use, but they get to, I believe applicants are required to come and present to the neighborhood councils, and neighborhood councils can issue advisory decisions. And of course, my neighborhood council was great, and we only did good things. But many of these, I think as you suggested previously in your comments on NIMBYism, like they kind of get captured by people who don't have like a randomly selected set of preferences on land use and development and transit in their communities.
Yeah,
I want to.
That's absolutely right. That
Yeah.
When there have been some studies that looked at the membership of neighborhood council boards, and it was extremely not representative of the population of Los Angeles and its diversity. It's kind of who you would expect: older people, homeowners, people with higher incomes and like higher levels of education. And what happens is those are still the people who end up getting to speak for the residents in their neighborhood and say that this is what we want, when maybe that isn't the case.
Yeah, and they're technically elected too, but the elections aren't like in tandem with citywide elections. Like you have to I think you had to physically go to vote for some of these. Like you have to physically be present. Like, I don't want to glamorize it, but like New England style, like if you're not physically present at the meeting, you didn't get a vote on who was on this. We could go down a whole rabbit hole on those. Something that like surprised me in your report is, so I would be, I always assume that like council members kind of love this power, right? Like every applicant has to come and like, genuflect and kiss the ring, right? And maybe make some campaign donations. But something that you picked up on is that like, there's candidate surveys and there's interviews with former council members. And I was surprised by the degree to which they don't really seem to want these powers. Like, I don't know, what do you think is going on there? Like, is that accurate? And like, why would council members not be like, yeah, this is awesome, like I love this power?
Yeah, I think you're referencing one of my favorite quotes in the paper, which is from Eric Garcetti when he was mayor, and he had been a council member for, I think, the full 12 years before that, where he said in an interview that, I'm going to butcher this quote, but basically that you would think that the council members love that everybody has to come kiss the ring and, yeah, you refer or give the council members that level of discretion, but that in fact they hate it, and that it takes up a lot of their time. It requires them to issue opinions on all sorts of little things that maybe they don't really care about. And just to clarify, it's not always the actual elected council member who is making this decision or in the meetings with the developers. More often than not, it's a high-level staffer, their planning director. But in terms of the candidate survey in 2022, the LA Times did a survey of everyone who was running for city council positions, or also, mayor, controller, various positions. And one of the questions they asked was, should LA reduce the power that the council has over land use decisions? And the vast majority of people said yes, that there should be a reduction, or a repositioning of who holds the power in deciding land use issues.
That is surprising. I wouldn't have thought. I mean, again, I just am thinking about San Francisco, which is a very small pond with a lot of very big fish in it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't talked to all of the supervisors about it, but I think they enjoy utilizing the powers and the capacities that they have to shape land use within their particular district. But I can also see, because as you described, like the districts in LA are so big that they're having to weigh in on, all kinds of different relatively small matters. And when you start taking positions on certain things, you make friends, but then you also make enemies, and you can like unnecessarily end up making enemies about something you don't actually care about so much. So I could see how that would be not preferable for them.
I do think that's what's happening. Is I'm sure that they do want to shape the future of their district by making these big decisions, getting a new ballpark or a new mall, or like things like that would be kind of exciting to the average person, and are they make headlines, people pay attention to them. I imagine that the council members do like to weigh in on those things. But when it comes to any moderate size apartment building with 50 units, I can't imagine that they care a ton about every single one of those that's being proposed in their district. Though I'm issuing my own position on that, or I'm projecting a little bit. But yeah, I think the other thing in terms of weighing in on issues that might be controversial is sometimes these projects are held up or they're facing labor disputes between building unions, and they obviously just want the best for their members. But if a council member is now between issuing a statement in favor of a labor union or in favor of a neighborhood association in their district, that could be complicated, that you are inadvertently siding with one group over another, giving, depending on the specifics of the project.
Yeah, so I guess I'm like thinking through this a little, like in certain districts where you have a really robust like base in one direction or the other, right? So maybe you have totally consolidated NIMBY power in one district and totally pro-growth sort of coalition interests in the other. But council members who are in districts where there's a division, right? Like that, this must be like just a source of like unpleasant decisions. I always think of, I mean, the greatest cultural artifact on like local housing politics, Show Me a Hero, right? Like the whole, I hope everyone has seen this, and if you haven't, it's amazing. Like we put elected officials kind of in these impossible positions where it's like you have to do things that are like they're no-win scenarios for you politically. Maybe that's what's going on. They're like, I think what you're getting at is like there are divided interest on all of these issues, and they're so small fry, and they're not the type of thing that people go into like public service to like be, exactly, was that rendering decisions on like a 75 unit apartment building, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And because the districts are so big, it really isn't the case that any one of the council districts is homogenous in terms of their views on land use. And I'm sure in every district there are some people who are more NIMBY and more YIMBY, or just responsive to the specifics of any project, right? And I think this comes up a lot in areas that are historically neighborhoods of color or lower income, where those areas are gentrifying, and market rate or mixed use buildings are being proposed in a district that does need more housing, and they want it, but maybe they don't want it there, or there's displacement, or things are just complicated. And so I think housing policy is always going to be complicated. I feel like if I've learned anything from writing this is there's a lot of opinions on any project, and most people are right in some way.
Yeah, I mean, what I find with that, at least in my experience, is that there are these incredibly large forces at play that impact people's lives, and some of them can be adjudicated through zoning and land use powers and others can't. But when there's like a physical manifestation of something, in the form of a building, like I can just take, for example, I remember in an area plan that San Francisco is trying to pass, I remember sitting through a conversation about whether pharmacies like Walgreens should be allowed by right, because there were some people who are like, well, I can't get my discount prescription medications through pharmacies like Walgreens, like they're not a local friendly pharmacy that would have a relationship with me that would provide me the discount that I need. And I just was like, my God, the whole issue of like the affordability of prescription medication is trying to get adjudicated through a local discussion about land use, and it's just it's insufficient. These authorities are just insufficient to deal with the problems that people are facing. And then I feel like through these conversations about or battles frequently about whether new housing is exacerbating or alleviating displacement, they get fought building by building by building, but really they're sort of a collection of, I mean, first of all, a collection of many decisions about land use altogether that can't be mitigated or solved or made worse potentially through a single building. But it's like the collective set of decisions have led us to this point, you know, but people are fighting about the thing in front of them that they can see. And it's sort of, it's heartbreaking, actually, you know, all these things that people want to actually be able to impact, like economic inequality, the loss of manufacturing jobs, these big sweeping trends that vastly shape people's lives. They end up fighting about them through a local land use battle. Yeah, and it's sort of, like I said, it can be really heartbreaking to see that, because it's like, that's not gonna solve the problem that you're trying to solve, you know. But what are the other ways you can solve those sets of problems? It's sort of hard to, it feels diffuse.
I mean, I think this is a really good point. I think that like you can't really understand like what's going on with current zoning without understanding like it's this kludge for so many other issues, right? I mean, this came up in the parking context of like AB 2097, let's get rid of parking mandates near transit. And you're like, okay, cool. Like any reasonable planner will say, yeah, good idea, get rid of your parking requirements near transit. No disagreement there. But the disagreement over the bill was like, well, but we use this to like force developers to the table to negotiate for other things. So if they want to get out of parking, we force them to come to the table to do like more affordable housing or local hiring, or yeah, I mean, sort of weird pseudo industrial policy at the local level, right? And it's like, well, so those are interesting and important things to be doing at the policy level, but like it's weird that we end up doing this through this like project by project negotiation. I had Rick Cole on recently, and he I think he introduced a resolution when he was on the Pasadena Planning Commission to rename it to the Reacting Commission, right? Because it's like so much like planning capacity just gets put into like not like forward thinking big picture. Okay, what do we want this community to look like? As Emily mentioned, like these community plans haven't been updated in 40 years in some cases, but like we just react whenever something gets proposed. And I mean, even if there are things that you want to do with that framework, it's just like a deeply like dysfunctional kludge that, you know, ideally we're actually sitting down and doing planning and thinking through the policies and having it apply universally.
Yeah, I also think it's like there's so many layers, right? There's like California tax policy, which we haven't hit on, but I mean, part of why, you know, part of what you describe in these, I don't remember how you just, I don't know if it was extortion or shakedowns or, you know, these decision-making processes with local plans where, you know, neighbors might actually get like an actual cash payoff. Like that's sort of like one matter. But if you're looking at the plan level scale and kind of the conversation about community benefits, it's so heated because the resources are so stymied because of California's completely, to borrow a phrase from your title, like it's just the most dysfunctional tax policy that you could possibly have for a state. I mean, you talk about like the glory days of the state of California pre-Prop 13, where you could like actually pay for things and we were building things and we had great schools and all this stuff. And then post Prop 13, now it's like everybody's like fighting for scraps to provide the community benefits that are desperately needed to accompany any new growth, or even to have like really wonderful, you know, cities, right? We need money for parks, and we need money for schools, and we need money to have great streets, and we need money for affordable housing, and we, you know, we need all of this, all these resources, and we have such incredibly limited tools to achieve those resources. And a big part of that is because of this tax revolt, you know, that happened in the 1970s, where people are like, well, we're sick of our property taxes going up and we don't understand what, you know, we don't understand much about like the or maybe it's a willful misunderstanding about like where tax dollars actually go and what they pay for, and so we're gonna like pass this thing, and it's just had the ripple impacts on development in a very devolved state like California have just, it's been, you know, it's breathtaking. And then you have all these workarounds. And so the people that I know that work in affordable housing, they're constantly trying to figure out like, how are we going to get more funding for affordable housing? Like, what can we do? And the tools are just so unbelievably limited. And it's a self-inflicted wound. I mean, I guess all of governance, you could see it that way. Like things that are dysfunctional, they're all self-inflicted wounds that could be changed. But it's really extraordinary. And then you think about, of course, that then you layer on what the federal government does and does not do to help address some of these challenges. And it kind of makes you want to move to a social democracy, or maybe me.
Well, I mean, like even short of social democracy, right? I was looking at this map of like, you know, local or revenue collected by property taxes. And it was like Texas, Illinois, New Jersey. And I'm like, these states have like kind of nothing in common, like politically, ideologically, you know, et cetera. But like they all kind of build like way more than like their peer states. So like, you know, like Texas, New Jersey, Metro Chicago, like still build a lot, right? And I suspect it comes down to that fact of like, okay, well, we have a kind of a new building gets built and like we get a whole bunch of new property taxes and we can use that money for fun things. And in California, we've said, well, no, you're not allowed to do that. So now you have to do this like weird project by project, like, you know, negotiation, but like squeeze some juice out of projects because we think they're not going to pay their own way because they just can't pay normal property taxes after, you know, so many years. And it's like, yeah, just do property taxes normal, right? Like just like let new development just pay for itself, and people will realize, okay, yeah, the new building got built. That you know, I don't like the traffic, but cool, we're getting a bunch of extra money. So, like that's like let that normal kind of governance process happen.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. So we did a paper with California Forward, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we looked at, because of course Prop 13, when it capped the property taxes, the share of property taxes that each city gets are different. They're historic. And so some cities get a greater share of the property tax and some cities get a smaller share. And so we looked at whether that impacted how much housing was approved in different jurisdictions in the Bay Area. And generally it did. And I think that California Forward did again another study that just came out. I believe it might actually be about LA. I'll see if I can find it. Looking at kind of that same question of what share of property taxes is captured, and does that impact what cities do? And of course it does. Of course it does. So anyhow, just another big problem for you young people to figure out how to solve. I'll sit by the fire and cheer you on.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of urbanists, if they were given a time machine instead of going back to like, I don't know, the 1700s or something, might go back to the 1970s and prevent Proposition 13 from passing, given what we know now. Or maybe that's just me.
Yeah.
But no, go ahead.
Oh, I just going to say, you brought up Measure U, sort of talking about time machines. And I mean, one thing we didn't talk about, and Nolan, this is something obviously you know super well, but just like sort of the framework for planning in California and how it's incredibly decentralized, like how the home rule power is just so strong. And so like each of these different jurisdictions get to make so many decisions, to have such power over land use. Even now, after all the changes at the state, they still have incredible authority over what happens between, you know, in each jurisdiction. And then how, because of everything, all the dynamics you talk about, Emily, in your paper, people's, you know, fear about growth and change and, you know, other sets of concerns, like the local decision makers are super responsive to their own constituents. And so you can just see how like the slow growth movement made its way across the entire state in like the 70s and 80s. And I think Measure U is sort of peak that. I just think it's like a really important kind of context point for a lot of these discussions about land use, just this like desire for slow growth, and then the use of ballot measures, which is actually what your colleague Emma is studying for us now. Like, we're making a catalog of all the local ballot measures that impacted whether housing can move forward in certain jurisdictions or not. And it's really interesting to kind of see like how they were clustered over time. And there's like many in the 80s, which sort of enshrine these slow growth principles. But it's shocking. And I mean, LA is the largest city in California. It's sort of shocking to know that there's this measure that was like a slow growth measure in Los Angeles. I mean, that's like kind of extraordinary in and of itself. So I guess that's a question. I'm sorry.
No, I fully agree. Yeah. And I think the slow growth era, if you can call it that, has really lasted until almost today. It's hard to say if we're still in the slow growth period or if we're in a pro-growth era. I think we are shifting into a more pro-growth mindset that increasingly everyone is realizing we really need to build more housing if people are going to be able to stay here and afford to live here. And I guess I'm hopeful that people are increasingly going to, vote for measures, introduce initiatives that encourage housing production rather than stymie it. And we've seen that in LA in the past few years.
Well, with groups like California YIMBY and SPUR working on the issue, I mean, it's just a matter of years before we solve this thing.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, like there are positive trends, and I think that's really important and slightly underrated. Like, it's a low baseline, but like LA is like hitting sort of recent, a peak for permits issued for, the past, I think 40 years or something. I mean, so like there is this surge in housing production that's happening mainly because of a big jump in ADU production, thanks Sacramento, and the TOC program, which I think you were kind of getting at that. Like, I don't know that voters necessarily knew that they were voting on like a pro-growth ballot measure there, but that's what it ended up being. And it created these sort of safe harbors from some of the stuff that you talk about in the report to say like, cool, like here's like, much more streamlined ways to get the types of additional density that previously would have required you to go through this discretionary political process. And it's kind of, Sarah, what we were talking about, like, okay, cool, like you build a certain portion affordable, use a certain labor standard, cool, do it, build. Like, we're not going to have this like project by project negotiation. Like, here are the public benefits that we want, you check the boxes, you get your permits.
Yeah, and like you said, the TOC program has been really impactful. So that's the transit-oriented communities. It's a TOD style program, passed by voters in 2017, I think. And the city planning department got to design the specifics, but I think voters did know when they were voting on it that it was to make it easier to build near transit. But I don't think they could have imagined the form with all the specific incentives and everything built out. But it has allowed a lot more proposed residential projects to go through ministerial review or by right. I don't know if we even said this, but instead of discretionary, the other alternative is that it's eligible for ministerial review, or just like check, this fits zoning, you can build it. You wrote a paper on this, Nolan, with some other people at UCLA, that shown that it speeds up housing production or entitlement and permitting by a lot. And that's what we need now, is like urgency and speed at which things are entitled. Otherwise, it takes years for a project to be approved and receive its permits before it can even begin construction.
Emily, one of the things I want to say is I love the way you started this paper, where you kind of gave the example of a developer and kind of what they, like a smaller scale developer, and what they would go through in the Los Angeles process. I thought that was really powerful because people don't often write from that perspective. So I thought it was just really interesting. And it's like, yeah, of course, if you're like somebody's just trying to build housing, like how would it feel to go through this discretionary process versus what would it feel like to go through a ministerial process? And I just thought that was incredibly evocative and like a really, really, really great way to start the paper, because it just illustrated this point so well. You're like, oh yeah, why would I spend, multiple years going through this like somewhat hellacious process to get to the exact same conclusion that I might otherwise get to without, this pain and suffering? And like, what is the good of that pain and suffering? Like, what is that what does that bring about? I thought that was really good.
Thank you. Yeah. And I will say that was probably the hardest part of the paper to write, because I don't typically write fiction. But it was inspired by a lot of things I've heard from developers, that they will choose not to propose a project unless they know it will be approved ministerially or approved by right. And they just will completely avoid the discretionary process because they know it can take a long time. They have to, quote unquote, kiss the ring of the local council member. It opens them up to appeals and lawsuits and CEQA and so on. So yeah, I appreciate the compliment, and I put a lot of thought into what's a typical experience, or something that you could put yourself in the position of a small builder.
Yeah. And then I have another compliment that I'd like to give to you, Nolan, which is about the YIMBY movement, because I've been working in land use it's been over 20 years now. And I remember exactly the moment when I read about the YIMBY movement starting in San Francisco. And at first, I mean, I will just be completely frank, I thought it was a joke that housing forces were playing on people who wanted housing to move forward. Like, oh yeah, new housing, the idea of it makes you barf. Like, that's literally what I thought when I read about it. I was like, they came up with a name to sort of make fun of SPUR and others who want housing to move forward. And then just to see what happened, it was like letting off like a fire, like just how many young people were like, no, this is ridiculous. And I was like, my God, yes, it is ridiculous. But I just always felt so, alone in these hearings, feeling these feelings when I would, be witness to, I mean, one thing we didn't talk about, but in San Francisco, every permit's discretionary. So I would sit through hearings where people would be, be like 3 hours about somebody's back deck, being transitioned to an addition or whatever. And people would be like wailing these hearings. And I'm like, this is madness. This is literal madness. But kind of getting back to the YIMBY movement, I just like watching as all of a sudden there's this kind of force of particularly young people just saying, you know what, like, enough's enough. Like, I want my rent to go down, and I want my friends to live here, and I want there to be more space for more people. It's just been so powerful in terms of the change in the conversation, and has really led a lot of this change at the state level. And Nolan, you were just talking about, ADU production's up, thank you state law. But like, when I started doing land use, nobody was like, oh yeah, we're going to allow ADUs. Everybody's like, that's verboten. Like, we'll never get ADUs. Well, that will never happen. Like, homeowners will never allow that to occur because it's going to mess with their parking. To today, where it's like, it was like, yes, ADUs, small is beautiful. Like, Casita Coalition, you're totally right. And it's just an absolute sea change. And it really makes me think about, if you think about like sort of the old days of growth, there was a lot of conversations about like these old like growth coalitions, which were very like business oriented, if you will, to today, where it feels much more groundswelly. I don't know exactly how to describe it. It does sort of feel like a new era for planning and for housing. And maybe like the problems are just so acute, and like the chick has come home to roost, or I don't know what the phrase is, but it feels like there's like, it's sort of like a zeitgeist, like a confluence of many different things that's leading to some of the reforms and successes that we see today.
Oh yeah, well, no, that's all nice to hear. I mean, it is remarkable. I was talking to a planner for some mountain west town, and they were adopting an ADU ordinance, and they were like, yeah, we introduced it, and like, you know, most of the people who were at the hearing were apathetic, and then a few people were like very strongly in favor. And like this planner was like reflecting, like, if we had done this 10 years ago, like there would have been like pitchforks and torches out, right? But like the culture around this stuff has so changed that like it's no longer, you know, a great book on this, like the types of people who showed up at these meetings, I think, and dominated them until quite recently, neighborhood defenders. Right, there was this notion of like the person going to the hearing and fighting the housing is this heroic defender of the community, and now it's like the discourse has just completely flipped, right? It's pretty remarkable. I do think of like what we're up to, and this is like a little bit of a cautionary tale, maybe. It's like we're kind of the inverse of what happened in the 60s and 70s, right? Like in the 60s, 70s, there was this like massive reaction to like high modernist urban planning where the technocrats were going to make all the decisions and they were going to control the zoning and where the freeways went and the urban renewal, yada, yada, yada. There was this revolt against that, right? And I think we slightly overstate the extent to which that revolt was a sort of something that was lining up with someone's financial interest, as opposed to like a shift in how people thought about the issue, right? And I think that's, it's funny because like every now and then on Twitter, like some NIMBY will get really upset and be like, oh, the YIMBYs are all on the payroll of developers. And I'm like, no, yeah, there's maybe 24 YIMBYs in the entire world who like collect a paycheck at all, and it's probably coming from like some tech philanthropy. It's like and then like thousands of people who are showing up at these meetings are like, they have full-time jobs and families and like hobbies, and they're doing this because they actually just believe like in housing abundance and micro, you know, multi-mobility and cities being beautiful and welcoming. It's been encouraging. I mean, I think, you know, taking it back to LA too, I think we're in a place where things just got so bad that like even the beneficiaries of the status quo were being hurt, right? Like even if you're a homeowner in California, like your young adult children can't afford to stay near you, you can't afford to downsize in your community, you leave your home and you see people living in tents and, you know, on the street. And so like things just got so bad that like we can't really deny the problem. And yeah, just to bring it back to LA, I think that's the situation we're in now, where why there's an appetite for, frankly, some of the things that you proposed, Emily, in this report would have been maybe unthinkable 10 years ago. But now folks are like, okay, are we going to have like a big giant corruption scandal, you know, every 5 or 6 years, and like just not have like, you know, housing built in like an equitable way? Or are we going to like actually sort of reckon with this issue and think of solutions? And you know, I'm an eternal optimist on the issue. I mean, just seeing the progress that's happened over the last 5 years, right? I mean, I think we're really only in the very early stages of a completely new California planning paradigm.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And not just California, but I do feel like YIMBY ideas are really spreading across the country, and more when I'm from Texas, right? So when I talk to friends there, increasingly people, I'll just say California YIMBY, and they actually know what that means. Sometimes I still have to define NIMBY and YIMBY and all that. But I know we've talked about how policies in the Mountain West and, you know, I think Arizona and Montana and Texas, and there are all these things that are increasingly pro-housing. And you know, the papers love to hate on California exporting its problems, but I think California is also exporting its solutions in this area. Yeah, and with LA, I agree that it's kind of gone to a boiling point where the crisis is unignorable. And I think people do see the need for community-wide or city-wide planning versus planning on a project-by-project basis. We've sort of talked about this off and on throughout this podcast, but like it is so ridiculous that you end up fighting over one individual project, like Sarah said, when really the problem is that the city isn't being planned to accommodate this, or the neighborhood plan is 20 years old. And talking to some planners when I was writing this report, that's a big frustration that people have, is that they're not even doing planning, they're doing code checking, they're doing enforcement of plans that were made long before they started working at the city. And yeah, I think people want to do city planning again.
So take us to the promised land here, right? Like ideas are being considered for reform. I think just today or last night, the council voted to, we're recording this on the 28th, voted to exempt affordable units from the site plan review threshold. Is that right?
I think that's coming up soon. But what they did yesterday, and granted, there's a lot to keep track of. The city council meets 3 times a week, so many meetings. But what they did yesterday was begin to codify Executive Directive 1, which Mayor Karen Bass passed, or I guess initiated in December, which makes any project that's 100% affordable or a shelter, emergency shelter, eligible for ministerial review. And I was listening to Councilwoman Katie Young-Yaroslavsky talk about it during the presentation, and Nithya Raman, and they were both saying that it is just like sped up development, entitlement and development of affordable housing by a lot. Like they said that the median length of time it takes to get an affordable housing project approved is now 37 days under ED1, which is like unbelievable. You know, usually it's 6 months or years, or when all these projects are discretionary, members of the community could come fight and say, we don't want a building that's 100% affordable in our neighborhood, and maybe it would get delayed for years. So the fact that these are getting approved in just over a month is like, I don't know, jaw-dropping to me.
Yeah, that's huge. I think another thing that you work through in the report, and Sarah, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as someone who's looked at a lot of different cities, is trying to depoliticize a lot of these. So like, of course, the ideal scenario here is we actually do planning, we update community plans, we update our zoning, we set rules, projects don't have to do discretion. But like short of that, right? Like having fewer of these projects go to city council. And I'll maybe like play devil's advocate a little bit here, right? Like I think a lot of people would say, well, it's good that things go to the council. That person was elected, they understand the local context. You know, why not let that person, you know, make the decision? In the report, I think you suggest, hey, let's let CPC or you know, certain planning staff be the final arbiter on some of these projects. But what's the big upside there? And why not say, yeah, cool, let the person who was elected by the locals make the decision on this?
Yeah, and I totally understand that perspective and why people would feel that way, especially in areas that are historically marginalized, where members of the public haven't had as much power to express what they want to see in land use and other aspects of city governance, that the council member can be almost like a protector or a voice for that community. But what happens is it's still the wealthiest communities, the widest communities that have the loudest voices and are able to block projects. And I think we see this in how affordable housing and just other multifamily housing projects have been distributed across the city in recent years, like where things get permitted. And it would be most fair if there were standard rules that applied to the whole city. And that isn't meant to be a punishment to any community. It's just meant to have a just standards that the whole city has to comply with, and it would make it harder for some neighborhoods to get out of doing their part, which is, I think, the case now.
Yeah, I just totally agree with that and completely relate to it. And then in the, in the San Francisco context, the western side of San Francisco tends to be lower density, tends to be wealthier, tends to be more exclusionary, and tends to be lower density. And then the eastern side is where for decades kind of all the rezoning efforts were concentrated on the eastern side of the city, where more low-income households and BIPOC households have lived, and there was a huge rezoning effort that the city did around was called the Eastern Neighborhoods, and it was basically like almost the entirety of the eastern side of the city. And you see a lot of planning effort being put into places, sometimes because there's sort of like more land that can be converted, either it's like industrial or like a base reuse or whatever, which is the case of San Francisco. So like there are good planning reasons why you might concentrate on those places, but a lot of times it's because the conventional wisdom is like, oh, the west side, like we can't do anything about that, they fight, they're off fighting fences between each other, like you're never going to get any housing there. And it isn't fair, and a lot of to the planning department's credit, like a lot of this round of the housing element is now focused on the west side of San Francisco, because you can't just let like both the loudest voices and the best finance voices win in every single fight, and basically like prevent plans from occurring in those places to begin with, because the fight is going to be too difficult. So I really relate to that, and it also just makes me think about Jenny Schutz, who's with Brookings, wrote a really, really great book on planning. And she talked a lot about like one of the things that needs to happen is that in places that there's the greatest demand, there should be ways of accommodating that demand. And the high prices and, places on the west side of San Francisco, or Rockridge and Oakland, or other, so-called high opportunity areas, should be accommodating a sizable amount of growth because so many people want to live in these communities.
Yeah. And also the west side of LA, funny enough. Well, maybe just the coastal side. Maybe
what's going on the west sides.
And just an example to that point, that historically there have been neighborhood associations in LA that have been able to get payoffs from developers for agreeing to not block their project. So I think it's the La Mirada Neighborhood Association would get these big, like hundreds of $1,000s payouts for initiating an appeal and a lawsuit and then ceasing that so that the project could go through. But the deal was that neighborhood association would get $250,000 to use however they wanted. And this is just like a group of people. It's not even like a nonprofit or something. So just like shocking who's able to exert power and who isn't.
Well, I mean, just to get a little spicier on that, right? Like it's kind of a weird subversion of democracy, right? You have like all of these weird, like superficially, it's like, oh, we're going to have this big public hearing and everybody's going to be heard. But then like that the people who show up at those hearings are not a random cross section of the community. And then two, there are all these weird backroom deals going on of like, if you don't, make a donation to my private group of people who are not elected, we're going to oppose your project. Or if you don't make a deal with my business group or my union, it just seems like a very sort of like, it seems like exactly the type of politicking that the like expanded public process was meant to like address. Like, we're done with the backroom deals. We're done with the like, unelected people sort of guiding the form of our community. but then it like had the opposite effect in a funny way of like turning that up to 11. It created these mechanisms where like far more of that could have happened than, you know, in a previous generation where there were, you know, fewer decision makers, you know, on what could and couldn't get built.
I mean, I guess it depends on who's making the backroom deal. You know, like I think in the bad old days, it was like, you know, developers, politicians, and labor. It was like the growth machine. And now one, you know, if we were playing devil's advocate, one could argue like, oh, now community groups get to be, you know, part of these backroom deals. It's just the question of like who is benefiting. Like, you know, Emily, in your example of this wealthy community that basically is getting like shakedown payments, like, is that really the best use of public benefit funds for the community? Is that the most equitable? Like, I would argue no. It's just how do you get to the point where government is representative and rules are fair, and the, you know, whatever resources can be gleaned from these developments are shared in an equitable manner. Like, the way we're doing it now is not that way. But I think the question's sort of still open about like, what way is that way?
Yeah. And there's also this paper from Michael Manville and Tanner Osman, I think, that is, to that point, talks about how members of the public really don't like when the council gets to usurp and make their own decisions that go against the rules. So the paper basically says the more that the council steps in and says, we're going to give carve out a little exception, give a variance, change the zoning, etc. for a project, the community views that as like, maybe there are special interests that have captured government, or that there was some backroom deal or something unsavory happening, and it can be perceived negatively. And so I thought that paper was just really motivating as I was writing this report, to understand like there is a world where the zoning code is actually followed. That world isn't Los Angeles currently, but you could develop plans that people stick to, and then you regularly update the plans to meet the current conditions and expected growth and all that. And yeah, I just, to your point, like there is a way that the community is satisfied without having to do these backroom deals, to use that phrase.
Well, and I think this is a really important point. I mean, even in cases where there's not like real graft or corruption or anything shady happening, I think to a normal person, discretionary permitting looks like graft, right? I mean, it's like, here, okay, I thought something could be built on this lot, and now they're changing the rules to make an exception for this particular developer. And like, you know, putting my YIMBY pro-housing hat on, I'm normally favorable to that. But like, returning to how a normal person engages with these issues, that seems like kind of funky. Like, why are we making a whole bunch of exceptions to the rules? And it's like, well, there's broader reasons of like, yeah, well, the rules are really bad and they're dysfunctional, and we all know that this is not going to get things that we want built, and or it's going to block things that we know we want. But like, still, the mechanism for like resolving that problem looks like shady, and I think it actually lowers public trust. I mean, you know, I don't want to say, I'm sure there are other examples, but like, yeah, like I'm trying to think of other examples where there's like, we have laws and rules on the books, and the notion is that they're almost completely protectual, and the starting position for like a negotiation. Like, you know, it's just like plea bargaining has this quality too. And I think people are like, yeah, that's, of course, like plea bargaining is often used to like get to maybe like the correct, or, you know, sometimes it's used, you know, to force people to, you know, plead guilty to something they didn't do, but sometimes it's used to maybe get closer to a correct sort of resolution. But even in cases where it's like correctly being used, it seems like corrupt and shady and just lowers public trust in the whole process.
Yeah, and public trust in the city of LA could not be lower now. So if I have one piece of advice, is that the city should try to recover and rebuild public trust in the council, which I think will be challenging. Like, Los Angeles is already not a very politically active city in comparison to San Francisco, which is, maybe there's too much political activism. Joking, I live in the Bay. But yeah, I mean, given all the scandals, given what we've learned about council members in the past few years, it's like kind of beginning from rock bottom. And I hesitate to say that because it sounds so harsh, but the city can only go up from here in terms of developing a relationship with its residents.
Emily, did you look more? I know you talked a little bit about Denver in the paper, but one of the things when you and I were looking at Denver that I was just so taken with is just the way it was like a yes-no system. It was like, yes, you can build it because it meets the rules. No, you can't. And I was just wondering, did you look any further into that and sort of how the public perceives that system? Because there could not be a more clear system, I think, than the one that Denver developed.
Yeah, I don't know how the public perceives it, but in general, the system is a form-based zoning, not use-based zoning. So that means that if a project fits the aesthetics of the neighborhood, if it's the appropriate size or height or design, that is what determines if it can be built. And what we've seen in Denver, I think, is an increase in permits since that change was made. But the city planning department makes virtually all the decisions about what can be made because they have this massive zoning code. It's like a book of, you can build these 70 or something types of projects, but you can't build anything else. And it's pretty rare that there are variances. And if there are, the city planning commission disagrees with the planning staff, and then the city council disagrees with the city planning commission, and it's really gives a lot of authority to the zoning code, and there aren't all these carve outs. It just says, like, it's pretty by the book, like you said. It's yes, this fits, or no, it doesn't, which is like a completely different model. And I think Houston is like that too, where they say if a proposed project fits the municipal code, they have to say yes. So the city planning commission can't say no. And that is like the complete opposite of LA and San Francisco. So there are just a lot of different models out there for how entitlement can be done.
Yeah, I don't remember if it made it into the final report, but I know another model that we talked a lot about was DC, where in DC, rezoning applications for specific projects, as I understand it, don't go to the council. The council adopts a future land use map as part of their comp plan or their master plan, whatever they call it. And then if the rezoning is compliant with what's in that future land use map, the CPC approves it. And these projects don't go to council. They don't get hyper politicized as much as you would expect. And, partly as a result of that, a city like DC seems to be building like a lot more than peer cities, on the Northeast Corridor. Which is, I mean, I would, you're saying Denver, and it's funny to me because I was thinking in these cities, because they seem to have like basically kind of sort of functional zoning systems, it seems like NIMBY energies get shifted to other mechanisms like preservation, right? So like DC and Denver both like regularly make headlines on, City Lab and Streets Blog for having like, jump the shark preservation fights. And I assume that's like, yeah, that's NIMBY's realizing, okay, we actually don't have like a lever to pull on like a zoning fight, so we'll pull like whatever other levers available and try to say this gas station is actually historic, please don't turn it into 400 units of housing, right?
Yeah,
I think the example in California is CEQA. I don't know if that's what you're going to say, Sarah. Or
no, I wasn't going to say CEQA. I was going to say it's interesting about the idea of NIMBY energy and like thinking about what that is about. Like if you can't actually affect like the the decision about whether the housing moves forward or not, kind of what would, what causes you to pour your energy into like a fight about, preserving a gas station. One of the conversations that Emily and I had when we were looking at different case studies across the country was with somebody who was talking about San Diego, and how San Diego is just really, it has all the problems, all the state level framework problems of an LA or a San Francisco, but just radically different outcomes for a variety of different reasons. And they've moved much more to buy right system. And Emily, you write about it in this report. But I remember in one of our interviews, one of our interviewees was saying, we're asked about like what caused, this change. And he's like, well, we just stopped asking, you just stop asking the question of, do you want the development or not? Like, that's not a question anymore that is asked of people and can be answered through this framework, So I guess all I'm saying is just interesting to me, the idea, like if you stop asking the question, people stop answering the question, and it stops being sort of a vehicle for that, whatever that set of feelings is, and then how much of it gets poured into historic preservation fights versus like how much of it gets poured into I don't know what else is it's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, and I think there is like that energy could be channeled into people getting really involved in community plan development, or other aspects that are more positive and like more democratic and moving in the direction of a beneficial city. And I mean, not necessarily NIMBY, but like there should be means and ways that people can be involved that aren't just deciding on every single project and going to 5 different hearings about one apartment building. Like that's not useful for anyone, and probably no one really enjoys like the screaming matches that sometimes occur.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree on this, but like you can do genuine outreach at the comp plan stage, right? Like you can do real focus groups and scientific surveys and hearings where, like, I don't know, maybe you actually provide childcare and some donuts and coffee, right? Like to actually get normal people to come out. You can do that at the comp plan stage. You can't do that on a project by project stage because, just by its very nature, it's going to be these ad hoc meetings that, we can't do a big, robust planning process around them. So, I'm always saying, this is not a question of like, well, do we give people a say or do we not? The question is like, how do you give people say in a way that A, makes sure that everybody actually has a say, and B, make sure that like, we're not just saying, do you want this project or not? Right? Like, do you want this specific project? Because that's like to me, like that's the most unhealthy form of like public process you could possibly have. And I think, Sarah, you were kind of getting at this, right? Like we host these meetings where like effectively the only thing you can kind of say is yes or no. And then like maybe like you can, technical planning term, you can like bullshit about like specific reasons. Like, well, I think this is going to cause traffic. I remember when I was in one of the last projects I worked on in New York City, we had somebody show up at a meeting and they didn't like the project. It's the first time that's ever happened. And they were like, well, I'm upset about the traffic impact. And I'm like, oh, well, this project did the New York City version of CEQA. I'm happy to share the traffic impact study with you. We found negative declaration, no impact. And they were like, oh, well, yeah, I don't trust that crap. Like that's all junk. And it's like, well, like, okay, like, are you like, if you're actually, if that's a valid concern, right, you should be somewhat interested in like what these technical experts in like, transportation engineering thought about like trip generation and mitigation. But, like effectively we'd said to that person, you can come to this meeting and you basically can say no. And the game for you is to come up with clever reasons why why we should take your no seriously. And then we are surprised when like these meetings have like a profoundly unhealthy dynamic, right? And I mean, it makes for like comedic gold with like shows like Parks and Rec, which is like only a very light parody of how these meetings can often go. But like the sheer amount of like anger and division that these meetings cause, I think is vastly, even above like the extent to which these things are mechanisms that slow down or stop housing, and especially affordable housing in high opportunity areas. That's all bad, but like I think there's like a broader sort of social dysfunction that flows out of this. Like this weekly ritual of like, we're all going to get together and have like our like 90 minutes of hate, like yelling at each other. Yeah.
It's it's incredibly emotional, and you have to think about why, it's, I think part of it is like your home is so important, like the concept of home and like feeling safe in your home is so important. And then change can represent physical change that you can see, not just people moving in and out, which of course is another set of change that comes from a housing shortage, but physical change that you can see can feel incredibly destabilizing. It's like, there are things that I cannot control that are beyond, that might impact my home. And I think it has to do with people's feelings about change and their feelings about safety. That's part of like what the trigger is. Like, Emily, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about, oh, those people might move in. It's like, whomever people have in their mind when I think about those people and they're going to move in and they're going to cause change, and it can just be like really psychologically destabilizing. And then there's all these rational reasons why that you could give, like traffic or whatever, to kind of put a framework around what those fears and anxieties are. But really, I think it has to do with the kind of feelings of safety and like sort of what people have control of and what they don't. And there's a lot we don't control. I mean, we basically control almost nothing in our lives, right? Very, very, very little do we control. It reminds me, I'll just tell briefly a story about one of the worst hearings I ever went to, which was in San Francisco. There was a building that was being used as a motel in the Marina District, which is a wealthy area of San Francisco. And there's a nonprofit that was seeking to convert not the building exterior form, but the use from a basically a motel to being housing for youth, low-income youth transitioning out of foster care. And of course, there was a huge fight about this and the CEQA appeal and, years and years and years, whatever. But the vitriol that was extended towards the notion of low-income youth moving into the marina was, I mean, there were like 100 speakers and people talking about, you didn't do a CEQA analysis of Lombard Street because the America's Cup is coming and there's going to be a lot of traffic because of the America's Cup. And then you're adding, these new youth to the neighborhood, like they're going to, foster care transitioning youth are going to have, a lot of cars. I mean, it's just like a completely outrageous articulations of, people just spinning off all these insane things because they were afraid of who was coming in. That was like baseline. They were like afraid of what it meant. They were afraid about what it was going to mean for, their own safety. They had just, it was a completely fear-based, and all that energy, all of it was channeled into these hearings. And it was really sad. Like, it was a very sad day for San Francisco, listening to, what people were saying when they got up to the dais for the 3 minutes to speak. So, I think we deserve a better public process than that. And I think, Nolan and Emily, both of you, what you're talking about, kind of channeling some of the energy into SPUR. For years, we talked about plans, not projects, like public input should be into plans. It should not be into projects. Conforming projects should move forward. Where the discussion should be is about the plans. And if the option is to have a fight about the project, that option will be taken every single time. So I don't know, we need something new. Maybe your paper will send us in the right direction.
Yeah, I really love that plans not projects frame. And I think there's an appetite for it now, because I think, we are sort of I feel like we're at the end game of the current system, and there's this realization of, okay, what comes next? And this is why I think reports like Emily's report are so important, is having those ideas that are ready to be taken off the bookshelf, right? When local LA legislators are ready, right? Like, hey, this is not like an unsolvable problem. In fact, with a few wonky entitlement process fixes, like, actually we can like massively improve this system.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about how, there's kind of a debate of like, does culture shape policy, or does policy shape culture, or chicken and egg? And I think this is an area where policy can shape the culture. We talk about Houston, like I mean, things are kind of discretionary, but for the most part, people are not paying attention to like what's getting built. It's pretty laissez-faire. You can build a duplex, you can build townhouses, sort of wherever. You can build like kind of tall buildings. And when I lived in Houston, people did not, well, besides one very significant example of opposition, otherwise people did not seem to care that much. Like, it wasn't taking up so much of people's mental energy and about individual projects. And then you move to the Bay Area and it's like every single project is a fight, and people are paying so much attention to it, and like public participation and civic engagement are good, but we can also have a world where people are not riled up about every project that could be in their town.
Yeah, when I was in Houston visiting, I would always ask people, why does your city not have zoning? To hear like their theory of it. I had like my like over intellectualized theories of like, oh, well, like maybe like Japan with the earthquakes, like the regular hurricanes get you this culture of like impermanence, and we just regularly have to rebuild. Maybe there's like some like wonky feature of like Texas law. But over and over again, everybody just told me, they were like, yeah, we just, as long as you're not hurting anyone else, you should just mind your own business. And I was like so like resistant to that like rather obvious cultural explanation. But like that's got to be it, right? Like we were talking about San Diego too. Like San Diego is so similar in so many regards to LA, but then they seem to have these radically different like planning processes, and it's like, well, why? It's like, oh, well, we just, we'd like to see more infill happening here, and we just think that's good for the city. And you're like shaking them like, no, like give me like the grand like physical reality or economic reality theory of why you're doing this. And it's just like, oh, this is just the culture down here.
It's so funny. I totally agree with that. And a couple years back, I wrote this whole paper on reforming. It wasn't related to zoning, but it was looking at the charter authorities in Oakland and kind of how the mayoral system functions or fails to function vis-a-vis the council. They have a very interesting and complicated kind of hybrid. It's neither weak mayor nor strong mayor. But a lot of people I talked to were like, well, the system worked totally fine, I guess this would depend on your political predilections, but when Jerry Brown was mayor, it didn't matter because, like the council was aligned with him and the system worked fine. So it was all just about kind of who was in these positions. Like the actual structure didn't much matter because the culture was such that, people were aligned and things could move forward. And so, yeah, it's just really interesting how if you have the right culture, you could have a bad system and everything's fine. And if you have the wrong culture, you can have a perfect system and everything will be messed up. So it's just, yeah, it's a little bit of a cautionary tale for those of us who like to think at the systems level.
When this is something that I think that is really important in Emily's report, is like a little bit of like the cultural history of LA, right? Like, I mean, the title, the Dysfunctional Metropolis, is like riffing on like, the reluctant metropolis, the fragmented metropolis, right? And like a key part of the cultural identity of LA is like LA as the anti-city, right? And like, so that's like, I think that's lurking in the background of like all YIMBY and transit advocacy, and bicycle advocacy, walkable advocacy here in LA. Is like, we're in this context where it's like this place was founded as we are the response to New York. We're the anti-city. We are like, you know, the like what's, you know, hundreds of suburbs in search of a city, right? Like that's LA's identity. That's how it like understands itself. And I think that's part of the challenge of that faces LA going forward is like, how do we like get ourselves out of this like adolescent phase and accept like, well, we are a big major global city, and you know, like it's not going to be your like eternal unchanging suburb with tract housing and strip malls. And I'm pretty optimistic on this. I mean, I think groups like Livable Communities Initiative are like, you know, taking a different, I think so often urbanists have this like take your medicine approach of like, well, the world's on fire and the traffic's really bad and the housing's really expensive, so we're so sorry, we have to build some townhouses and some bike lanes and some bus lanes. And like, I think what groups like LCI and even, you know, part of the YIMBY message is like, no, actually this is good, like you should get excited about this. Like your town doesn't have to like be this place that's like totally stagnant and stuck in like an urban design vision that doesn't reflect reality anymore. Like things, you know, like YIMBYs are always saying it on Twitter, right? Like a better world is possible. And when you start to think of it that way, like reform stops seeming like this take your medicine, you know, all right, like time to go on a diet. It's like, no, this is an exciting like way that we can tee up like something much better.
SPUR did this report. Well, both of you know we did this thing called the regional strategy a number of years ago, which was this idea of you know, if we actually were effective at solving the problems that we seek to solve, like what would the Bay Area be like and what would it look like? And one of this, the cool projects that we did as part of that, my colleague Ben Grant did, was this idea of, we called it model places, where we took different places, different types of places that exist now in the Bay Area, and we talked about what would happen if you upzone them. And we did, and it was like an urban design exercise, and we ended up with all these like really beautiful pictures of like, okay, what does it actually look like if you upzone, and like, you know, think about how nice it could be, and it could actually be additive and it could be better. And we actually ended up commissioning some artists to do some artist renderings of some of these places, and it just really helped people visualize like exactly what you're saying. It's not take your medicine, okay, we have to do this because otherwise we're all going to like fry in climate change, which is true, but it's also like, no, this could be much better. Or the places that we have right now could be better, and they could be places that we enjoy more as a function of this growth and change.
Yeah, and where there are more options. You know, a lot of people want a single family detached home, and those aren't going away anytime soon, especially in LA. Like there will still be those, and there will be condos, hopefully, and townhouses and density. And, you know, I feel like planning and zoning, as they're done in California, have really limited the options people have in terms of where they can live.
Emily, I mean, so you've spent the last 6 months or so really, really focused on this. I'm wondering, you know, is there something that you changed your mind on over the course of doing this report?
Oh my gosh. So I feel like the easy answer is that I was kind of like I thought I would like hate LA, or like have these like negative perceptions. And I went to LA and I was like, wait, I kind of like it. Like I get it now, and I feel like I have quite a bit of appreciation for Los Angeles. So that's one like easy answer. And that's also so people who read the report don't think I'm just a hater. But two, like I come to this and local government and policy in general being really interested in community engagement. Like I think when I applied to grad school, one of my paper application essays was about how like I wanted to figure out how local governments could do community engagement and public participation better. And that's really informed by a sense that like more is better. And what I've learned or changed my mind about is that it's not always better. And thinking about like how it's actually employed and what are the strategies that can be used to do it better. I think I wrestle with that in my head a little bit of originally coming from this as like, we should have more public participation. And now increasingly, I'm like, maybe we shouldn't have any or have less. So I don't have a final opinion on that, but it's definitely something I think about all the time.
Yeah, I think something that I came away with a little bit more of an appreciation for, I mean, I mentioned it a couple times on this interview so far, is just the why we ended up with the institutions that we have in LA, and just, you know, the recent political, you know, I mean, LA has been on this kind of crazy roller coaster of dramatically different land use planning institutions, and realizing like the extent to which things have like we haven't really had one land use planning system over the last 100 years, and I believe you cite a great paper on this, the 4 planning regimes of LA, just how like dramatically the land use governance has fluctuated. And I think there's like a case for optimism in that, right? Of like some of the like ideas that you're proposing in the report like seem like big and radical now, but like they're so timid relative to like the dramatic changes that have happened, you know, over the course that had happened over the course of the 60s and 70s, or, you know, when LA was first like setting up a zoning system in the 20s and teens. And I think like having that section in the paper sort of quietly makes the recommendations that eventually come like seem less impossible. Like previous generations did like have the courage to say, no, we can radically rethink these institutions to reflect like our current needs and values, and they did it, right? And like we should like be brave enough to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And I hadn't specifically thought about it that way, but I totally agree. And just to give an example an example of like a really radical change that happened not that long ago is up until I think 1969, 1970, the city was zoned for 10 million people, and they reduced the zoning capacity to 4 million people, which fun fact is what the population is now. So we have reached that limit. But not that long ago, the city could have accommodated so many more people. And it just, that's probably one of the like fun or not so fun facts that I always tell people about this report, is just that insane downzoning that happened. And we can kind of start to reverse that.
I found that totally mind-blowing. I was just like, oh, like my heart hurts. Went the other direction.
Agreed. Yeah.
It almost makes you wonder if the housing shortage is a policy choice. Yeah, someone should look into that. I want to give you the last word here, Emily. I'll just quickly say the report is the Dysfunctional Metropolis, let me get the subtitle right, Reforming Los Angeles's Land Use Planning and Entitlement. Already making a splash. Folks in LA are already thinking about it. I encourage listeners to go check it out. And of course, Sarah, I wanted to bring you into this conversation partly because you used to work with Emily, but partly because you have work coming out on this, and hopefully we'll discuss that specifically in a future episode. Playing us out here, Emily, what top line, somebody who is in a position to move the ball on these issues in LA, what do you want them to take away from this report?
Gosh, that's a harder question than it should be. But just I think something we've explored in this conversation is it doesn't have to be this way, and to think about how the current system incentivizes bad behavior, like the corruption we've seen, and also bad outcomes, and to think about how there is a world where land use policy encourages good governance, and it doesn't require corruption to get anything to happen, and also creates a better city, and doesn't have to be decided at the project by project level with screaming matches like Sarah described. I think that's probably my elevator pitch.
Emily Jacobson, thanks for joining Abundance.
Thank you. This was so fun. I'm glad I was finally on the podcast. And thank you, Sarah.
Oh, my pleasure. It was so great to talk to both of you. And Emily, I'm just so excited for this paper. It's wonderful, and everybody should read it.